So, Aral, you were keynote speaker here at WebTomorrow. Main topic, privacy.
And human rights and democracy.
And human rights and democracy. So basically the fundamental Bill of Rights, right?
Well, you know, the things that matter to us as human beings, the things that truly matter in terms of our welfare, the things that determine the quality of our lives. So, you know, we might own corporations, we might work in corporations, but we're not corporations. So I think one of the key messages that I tried to get across was that we have to think about ourselves as human beings and the kind of world we're creating for ourselves, the kind of habitat we're creating for ourselves through some of the short-sighted decisions that we're making as part of corporations. And you have to realize a corporation, one of the things that it does is it absolves you of individual responsibility. So if you think about a whole large group of people, each absolved of individual responsibility, working towards a certain aim, creating profit, that begins to seem a lot like a mob. That begins to seem a lot like a psychopath. And I think we're seeing the kind of world that sort of construct creates. And quite possibly that's not the world that's best for us as humans, and maybe not what we want to be living in.
Okay. Have we seen this before? I mean,
I think we have. I think there's a great correlation. I mean, if we look at history, there was a period of feudalism, right? There were feudal lords who owned the people on their lands and owned the lands. And then we went away from that a little bit. There was a period of slavery where we sold people's bodies, right? Today we have a different system. We have a group of corporations that are hugely wealthy and hugely powerful. So in a way, corporate lords. We have a feudalistic system. And we have a business model that is the Silicon Valley business model that doesn't sell people's bodies, but it sells everything else about a person that makes them what they are. We call that data, we call that personal data, etc. But really, it is everything else apart from your corporeal self that makes you who you are. It's your digital self. And these digital selves have no rights today. That's what we should be talking about in the EU when we're talking about, you know, digital Europe or digital programs in Europe. The only thing I hear is talk of business, 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 and it's all Silicon Valley lobbied talk. You know, we're really at risk of losing our democracy. We should be talking more about this and taking action, not just talking.
So if you talk about losing democracy, I mean, what can institutions or governments do about that? I mean, because fighting a billion-dollar corporation is quite hard, right?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to do is we need to remove corporations from the table. This is the opposite of what we're doing, the opposite of what's fashionable today, right? We talk about multi-stakeholderism, we talk about public-private partnerships, we talk about co-regulation. All of this is inviting corporations to the table, knowing full well that they're going to be paying for the table, right? And that they're not equal stakeholders. I mean, if we talk about multi-stakeholderism, everybody has a stake. Not everyone's stake is the same size. When I was at the Internet Governance Forum in Istanbul, there were lots of stakeholders. But when you looked at every meeting, there was almost at every meeting someone from Google. Why? Because they can afford to. Google's stake was so big that they could erect a tent around it outside, and they did. They called it a big tent, and it was on the actual program as an external event that's happening. That company, that entity doesn't have the same size stake. They have a huge stake.
Do you have any,
and this is institutional corruption. You know, this is what Lawrence Lessig, I believe, would call institutional corruption. Not corruption like the company saying, hey, here's some money, do you want to put that in your drawer? No, it's institutional. It is an economy of influence, an influence within an economy of influence. That's what we need to say no to. You know, and initially we can start by not seeing it as a positive. Right now, we're at the opposite end of the spectrum. We're all like multi-stakeholderism, co-regulation, ha-ha business. But what about our human rights?
Do you think, I mean, of course we're assuming that all that data is going to be used in some way against us or could be used against us, right? Do you have any examples of that already happening?
Oh, I mean, yeah, lots and lots of examples. I mean, if you talk about data being used against people, then we only need to look around the events of World War II. You know, we saw how having personal information that lets you categorize people has been used against people. If we're talking about data from corporations, we have people who have gone to jail in various countries because of what they posted on Facebook, what they posted on Twitter, what was shared with governments from those systems, both willingly and not willingly. Basically, we are giving entities whose only remit is to provide quarter-on-quarter revenue growth our public sphere. We're saying our digital public sphere, the equivalent of our parks, is going to be privately owned. And we don't seem to see the problem with that. The problem with it is that those instruments are core to democracy. Democracy isn't just a vote. Without democratic instruments and institutions, we don't really have a democracy. We just have, you know, some sort of rule of the masses, you know, maybe a tyranny of the majority, not democracy.
And it's not getting any better. I mean, the internet is going to be, things are going to be connected,
well,
more people are...
Especially if we don't root out the institutional corruption that's at the core of the problem. It's not going to get better as long as we're asking the wolf to have input and maybe to lead the policy making for the sheep.
That's clear. So how do you think that is possible? Because of course it's very hard to do that again, fighting those billion-dollar organizations, but also fighting our own culture, because right now, as it seems, we don't seem to matter a lot, we don't seem to care a lot that our data is being shared, or we do it ourselves, right?
It's a lack of caring. I think it's a lack of understanding exactly how it's used. And you can't fault people for this, because there are lots of very smart people working in these companies whose job it is to mask that fact, to create the illusion that these are safe spaces. You look at Google, it's all about, what do you think about Google? When I think about Google, with everything I know, I still think gorgeous little doodles, beautiful colors, you know, and then I have to remember what they're, exactly. And you know, a lot of effort goes into building that illusion. Because again, the illusion of a safe space is all they have to compete with, because they're not a safe space. They're not a private space. Their whole purpose is to learn what they use about you to manipulate your behavior, either directly or through third parties manipulating your behavior.
So what what's the alternative? Paying for the services?
The alternative is to create independent technologies. Yes, we pay anyway. It's how you want to pay and what the ramifications of one way of paying are versus the effects of another way of paying. So we know that the ramifications of paying with our data, with ourselves, that's what we're doing. We're really selling ourselves, not our bodies, but everything else. And the ramifications of that are that we are losing our commons, we're losing our public sphere, and we're losing our democratic instruments. So that's a high price. Apart from the cost that, you know, apart from the profit that Google makes directly from it, that's a high cost. Let's factor that in to say actually buying a product.
But it's a very abstract cost, right? Losing democracy,
but
what's
that's
that?
Our problem. That's the problem with, in a way, it's entirely understandable, right? These are evolutionary traits. We actually have base evolutionary traits that make us seek the next source of glucose, right? And the next hit of dopamine. Because in the past, these have not had any negative traits to our evolution, right? It meant if you ate the next fruit you found, right, that meant that you stayed alive in order to pass your genes on to the next generation, evolutionary success, right? Today, if you put every source of glucose, of sugar you find into your mouth, you will die from obesity. Because we live in a different world today, and the difference is technology. Technology is the multiplier. So we can't, the things that worked for us in the past, in our hunter-gatherer past, or even in like 200, 300 years ago, we didn't have the technology in order to pose a serious threat to our species. Not to the world. We still don't pose a serious threat to the world, right? We fuck things up to the nth degree. Bacteria will still survive and live, right? We don't even know. There are places they live we haven't even been, right? What we can do is we're one fragile species. We can wipe ourselves out, and we have the technology now to do that. So the things that worked for us in our past, before the multiplier effect of technology was so great, and it's exponentially increasing, right? Those same evolutionary traits are now a hindrance, but we have other evolutionary traits. We have higher order evolutionary traits, right? The things that make us care about one another, create societies, love one another, right? These are also things that led us to be alive, to stay alive, because we didn't just kill each other when we were just a small group.
But it's also what Facebook does. I mean, it makes us feel closer to each other, right?
Well, in a sense, but that's the illusion. And again, what we need to do is embrace those traits. I don't even think that we need the concept of altruism to do this, because if you talk to like some libertarians like from Silicon Valley, they'll be like, it's all about selfishness, is the best thing, you know, yay capitalism, let's just do that. Okay, all right, let's not even think about altruism. If you want to be altruistic, there's nothing wrong with that, you know, that's like awesome, that's great. But we don't even need that. We just need to define selfishness for the modern era that we live in today. And that's to understand that individual freedoms and what's good for the individual and what's good for the commons, to have a healthy commons, a healthy public sphere, these are not a dichotomy. One is a prerequisite for the other. If we can't understand that, then I really do feel that our species, at least in terms of welfare, perhaps in terms of survival, doesn't have a very bright future to look forward to. But if we can understand that, so what the traditional libertarians are doing is not being selfish, they're being stupid. There's a big difference there. They're defining selfishness in the shortest possible term. So let's define it. They just don't
realize that.
Exactly. Let's define selfishness properly to mean things that benefit our individual, ourselves and our individual freedoms, but for that we need to nurture the commons. We need to build sustainable businesses, not this sort of, you know, this sort of casino-like economy that we've created. That's what it is. We're building temporary businesses and in the hope that we were going to, you know, bet on them and we're going to lose 9 times out of 10, but we need that 10th one to be $1 billion success. That's gambling. Okay. We're gambling the future of our species away.
Well, that's quite dangerous, right? I mean,
I would say so.
There's a lot at stake. So in your private life, in your personal life, how many hate mails do you get from those corporations?
You'd be very surprised, actually. Very few from, of course, the corporations themselves. I mean, for one thing, we're a tiny social enterprise. Any sort of corporational level acknowledgement would probably just, you know, invoke the Streisand effect and actually get us more visibility, although we do have quite a lot of visibility. Some hate from a few people within these organizations. And you have to understand that a lot of people who work at these organizations, especially who've been there for a while, started when we thought the web was a good thing. When we thought that was the answer, they started for the right reasons. A lot of people who work there today work for the right reasons. You can't fault them. Because as much as there's an illusion being created for the users, there's an illusion being created for the people who work there. Now, I would be very surprised if Eric Schmidt was surprised at their business model and what they do. But I wouldn't be too surprised if an engineer working there
doesn't realize what he's doing.
And what she or he is doing, because they only see the immediate effects. They only see, again, the superficial aspects of it sometimes. So it's understandable. And that's why we need to create alternatives. Because there are good people working at these companies, and once it's better known and more widespread what they're actually doing, once people really understand it, those people are going to need a place to work where they feel good about themselves as well. So we need to create those places of work as well.
Okay. But then again, I mean, everybody needs to be convinced of the fact that the alternative is better than what we're currently doing, right? Because if not, probably those new startups will charge you for certain services.
Well, again, startups. So startup is a brand. Startup is a Silicon Valley brand. Startup does not mean a new business. It is a very specific type of new business that takes venture capital, that is probably based on selling data and monetizing data, and will either IPO or be bought by one of the larger
That's for you, a startup, let's say.
Yeah, data
selling
companies.
Data.
Exactly. So what we are, for example, is not a startup. We're a social enterprise, we're a new social enterprise, but we're an indie. I mean, our name is indie, but we are an indie as well. That is as opposed to the opposite of a startup.
Yeah.
So we are a small business, we're for profit, but we don't have any equity. We are a company limited by guarantee in the United Kingdom, which means that we have no equity, no shares. We couldn't take venture capital even if we wanted to. We don't.
Okay.
But we've made it so we can't. We can't sell because there's nothing to sell. We can make revenue, we can make a profit, and we can create a sustainable business that way.
Okay.
And if anyone wants to invest in us, they can invest in a share of that revenue, really invest in our success, not bet on whether or not we'll get sold at a couple of billion in a few years' time.
Is that a model that is accepted already? I mean, do you see more companies doing that?
I think it's a model that a lot of companies have used in the past. Some are using, especially in Europe today, you know, whether it's through bootstrapping or through maybe some forms of collective crowdfunding, etc. Although crowdfunding can be used for equity as well. So we did that. We crowdfunded for donations initially, and we raised a tiny amount, over $100,000, a little over. But that's keeping us going right now, and there are no strings attached. That's the key thing. We have full control. So the things that we want to do, we have a chance of doing them. If we took venture capital, there'd be no way we could do that. So we're really not talking about, for example, a charity or a not-profit as the only thing that can create an alternative. No, we can create sustainable businesses. And this is a key point, because these Silicon Valley companies, when they go to the European Commission, to the European Parliament, they say, either you are you are for what we're doing, the way that we're doing it, or you're against jobs, you're against innovation. That's not true, not at all. That's one way of doing things, a way that's toxic to our freedoms and democracy. There are other ways of building technology. Okay,
so what's needed to make privacy and human rights cool? I mean, it could be cool as well, right?
Privacy and human rights are cool.
Yeah, but what's needed for, let's say, the startups?
I think what we need really, again, it's not startups. Startups are not going to fix this problem. The web is not going to fix this problem. We need to create distributed systems, right? And to make it cool. And I don't know if cool is really what we should aim for, but to get the message across, right? To make it accessible probably is the most important thing. We need to start talking human, especially in the free and open source worlds. We talk a lot of tech. We create very convoluted solutions that are fun to tinker with if you're into technology, but not for everyone else. They're just incomprehensible.
So that's very few thinkers about
exactly.
Technology.
We start to, and don't get me wrong, people are doing amazing things. They're building great infrastructure. They're building great tools, but they're not accessible to a non-technical public.
Yeah.
So, and we can't just take them and put some paint on them and make it accessible. We need to start with design. We need design-led free and open technologies. That is what independent technologies are.
Are there any...
It's a new place.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you look at the timeline, you have free software, Richard Stallman 30 years ago, Tim O'Reilly, open source 20 years ago. This is our answer to the challenges of our time. Saying free and open source is awesome, free especially as in freedom, as in liberty. But if we don't combine that with short-term design for the experience, that's a long-term design, right?
Yeah.
If we don't combine that with the short-term design to get whole-term design, then we can't meet the challenges of today. We can't compete with the Googles and Facebooks because they compete on convenience. We can't disregard that.
Yeah, I mean, are there any options right now? I mean, if I want to...
There are stopgaps, various levels of stopgaps. Again, ones that are very convenient. Like, for example, I use Fastmail, and it's not encrypted, but it's also not owned by Google.
Yeah.
So that's a tiny stopgap. Now, if there are encrypted services like Proton Mail, etc., that I can start to use if I wanted to do that for email, just for email. I can start looking at maybe decentralized cloud solutions like OwnCloud, etc. Now, those are not always up to scratch in terms of the user experience again. So maybe I'll look for a small hosted solution first. The best thing we can do really is to start finding and supporting alternatives to Google, to Facebook, etc. And even though they're not perfect, us as individuals, and also at the European level, etc. Like my social enterprise right now, I don't think we could get European funding even if we wanted to. I don't think there's a fund for us. Everyone's funding startups. Everyone's funding this toxic system. Yeah. So there are many things. I don't think there's one silver bullet. Reagan mentioned that in her talk as well on privacy, her excellent talk earlier. There's no silver bullet. We're in a chaotic system, and we need to address every aspect of this issue separately. So there's something every one of us can do. I think that's the key thing. The only thing that the system requires to continue as it is for you to do nothing. The smallest things you can do will make an impact, especially in aggregate or on aggregate. And that's the key thing.
Okay, is there a, I mean, that's the case in a lot of problems, right? That people in general don't...
A lot of those problems are interlinked as well.
Yeah, but what I mean is, a lot of societal problems are created because people, let's say the common people, don't see the consequences of certain actions or certain tendencies, right? And normally, or in what we've seen is that an intellectual elite can lead those kind of
they're not as intellectual as they like to think of themselves either.
The thing is there a lack of intellectual elite in terms of these kind of subjects?
I think
because
maybe
you don't see them.
More than that. They're there. I mean, there are people who are speaking fervently about these subjects. You know, you have people like Yevgeny Morozov, for example. You have people like Jacob Appelbaum. You have people who work at the EFF. A fewer number of people are speaking out about corporate surveillance, but they exist as well. I mean, Reagan today, she touched upon those subjects as well. She basically didn't call it that, but as I see it, she touched upon institutional corruption. So there are lots of people talking about this. It's not always in the interests of the powers that be to amplify their voices, but thankfully, again, some of their networks, we can do it by ourselves.
Yeah.
But I think the key problem is that we've created a system that rewards the sort of behavior I explained before that corporations engage in, the psychopathic behavior. We've created a system of laws that rewards this sort of short-term destruction of our own habitat. And that's what it comes down to. Whether it's the environment, the tangible environment around us, or our psychological environment or a sociological environment, we are effectively destroying our own habitat. And there are reasons for this. I mean, at the very core of our societies, we don't have pillars of rationality. We have irrationality at the core of our societies, right? We still tolerate intolerance. We still tolerate things that were written by nomadic herdsmen 2,000 years ago, and we found our societies on that sort of irrationality. And then we get confused or we get surprised when we exhibit irrational behavior. You know, so we really need to look at the core of the issues. Two things I think that we cannot engage in anymore, that we don't have the luxury of navel gazing in, is, the best way I can put it is tolerating bullshit. We have to stop tolerating bullshit in all of its forms.
Well, that's hard, right?
It's hard, it's not easy. It's realizing that, we've kind of created this tree, we've planted the seeds, we've created this tree, and now we're in the branches, and now we're thinking, well, we planted this seed, it was bullshit, and we got this bullshit tree, and we're in the branches now, and why do we have bullshit fruit? Because it's a bullshit tree. Yeah. It's the only fruit you're gonna get. And as I was saying in my talk, pruning the branches or coloring the leaves, which is kind of what we're doing, that's a level of intellectual discourse that we're engaged in today about the problem, is not going to change the fundamental nature of the tree. In an era where we have the capability through our technology of destroying our own species, and we're engaged in it right now, we cannot afford, basically, to engage in this sort of navel gazing. We have to stop tolerating bullshit if our species is to have a future in all of its guises. And that's hard. Yeah, but we need to start planting a different tree, a tree with far more meaning.
Okay. Well, Aral, thanks a lot for
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Your very inspirational speech.
Thank you.
And I think the whole
and believe
audience
me,
learned a lot.
It can be done. I talk about a lot of the problems that I see. And you might think, oh my gosh, he must be really depressed, he must be really pessimistic about it. I'm not. I don't know if I call myself an optimist, but I think I would at least say that I'm a realist with imagination. Yeah. I think that's what we're lacking. With imagination, we can change this. I think a small group of people with that sort of imagination is all that has ever changed these things. Yeah. So yeah, I'm I'm not pessimistic about it.
Well, that's a good thing. There's hope.
There is hope.
Right? Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, man.
Thanks.